Starmer has just faced one of the most humiliating diplomatic rejections in recent memory. In today's video, we will be diving into the details and going through everything. Keir Starmer has just suffered one of the most embarrassing diplomatic rejections in recent history, as Riyadh completely dismissed his proposal for NATO peacekeeping troops in Ukraine. At a high-stakes press conference, Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov outright rejected Starmer's idea, making it clear that any foreign troops, even under the EU or national flags, would be seen as an act of provocation by Moscow. This brutal rebuke underscores the growing divide between Western ambitions and Russia's firm stance on military presence in Ukraine. If you've been watching our content but haven't subscribed yet, you're not alone. Over 98% of our viewers haven't subscribed. If you want to stay updated with the latest news in a clear and simple way, now's the perfect time to subscribe. By subscribing, you'll be among the first to know about all the new updates. We're committed to being a trustworthy source, bringing you the news in the best way possible. Just hit that subscribe button to stay informed with us. In the world of politics, there are moments that define history, not because they are triumphant, but because they are monumental failures. This is precisely what happened to Keir Starmer, who attempted to insert himself into the Ukraine peace process, only to be met with one of the most humiliating diplomatic rejections in recent memory. It all unfolded in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where global power players gathered for a summit that few expected would shift international dynamics so drastically. At the negotiating table sat U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov, engaging in discussions that seemed unthinkable just months ago, a direct diplomatic reset between Washington and Moscow. Europe, the UK, Ukraine. None of them were invited. As cameras captured the historic moment, Keir Starmer was in London, watching events unfold like any other political spectator, utterly powerless. But rather than accepting his irrelevance, he decided to force his way into the conversation. A losing bet, when you try to play a game too big for you. In a desperate attempt to assert influence, Starmer proposed what he believed to be a game-changing idea, deploying NATO and EU peacekeeping forces to Ukraine to enforce any future peace deal. It was a bold statement, but Starmer seemed oblivious to the geopolitical reality at play. Did he really believe Russia would accept the presence of foreign military forces on Ukrainian soil under the pretense of peacekeeping? If so, it was a naive and costly miscalculation. Instead of admiration, Starmer was met with a brutal and immediate rejection from Lavrov, who did not even bother with the usual diplomatic politeness. The presence of foreign armed forces, whether under the NATO flag, the EU flag, or national flags, changes nothing. This is unacceptable to us. It was a moment of public humiliation. Not only did Lavrov dismiss the idea outright, but he made it clear that any British attempt to play a role in Ukraine would be viewed as a provocation by Moscow. The implications were undeniable. Starmer had put forth an idea that was dead on arrival, exposing his lack of diplomatic influence on the world stage. But the real blow was yet to come. Riyadh made history, and Starmer watched from afar. As Starmer struggled to process the diplomatic snub, the news from Riyadh delivered an even greater shock. The US and Russia had agreed to fully restore diplomatic ties. Peace talks between Washington and Moscow were now officially on the table. Donald Trump had shifted American foreign policy in a radical new direction, sidelining Europe completely. And Starmer? He wasn't even in the room. For Europe, this was a nightmare scenario. For years, EU policy had been built on the assumption that the West was united against Moscow. But now, the US had decided it no longer needed European involvement. Instead, it would deal directly with Russia to end the war. As for the UK, which has long prided itself on being a diplomatic heavyweight, it found itself in an embarrassing position. No one asked for its opinion. No one consulted it. And when it tried to force its way into the discussion, it was slapped down in public. Starmer had overestimated Britain's role in global affairs. The truth was undeniable, Britain was no longer a key decision-maker in this war, and its leader had just learned that the hard way. What does this mean for Ukraine? And if all of this wasn't bad enough, things in Kyiv were even more precarious. President Volodymyr Zelensky, whose administration has depended entirely on Western support, suddenly found himself abandoned. For years, Ukraine had been assured that no deal could be made without its direct involvement. That was the position of the Biden administration. But Trump's approach was different. Ukraine was no longer central to the negotiations. When Zelensky learned what was happening in Riyadh, he issued a defiant statement, insisting that any peace agreement that does not include Ukraine is illegitimate. He doubled down on his demand for Ukraine to return to its 2014 borders, including Crimea and the Donbass. But the harsh reality is that Zelensky may not have a choice. If the US and Russia proceed with peace talks without Ukraine, Kyiv will face only two options. Accept the deal that is imposed on them, even if it is against their interests. Continue the war without sufficient Western backing, a scenario that could be catastrophic militarily, politically, and economically. And in the midst of all these shifts, the biggest question remains. Has Europe lost its place on the world stage? For years, the European Union has portrayed itself as a strong and unified geopolitical force. But what happened in Riyadh exposed a painful truth. When it comes to the world's most crucial decisions, Europe is no longer at the table. European leaders scrambled to respond. French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz rushed to hold emergency talks in Paris, attempting to find a way to remain relevant in the discussion. But the writing was on the wall. Trump had set a new course for American diplomacy, and Europe was left struggling to keep up. As for Starmer, he had staked everything on the idea that Britain should play a leading role in Ukraine's post-war security. He tried to push for the deployment of British troops. Russia said no. He wanted to be part of the discussions. He wasn't invited. He hoped to position the UK as a key player. The world moved on without him. It was a bitter lesson in realpolitik. Rhetoric and ambition mean little when you lack the influence to back them up. Final thoughts: who is really leading global diplomacy? The message from Riyadh was crystal clear. Trump is reshaping global diplomacy on his own terms. The US and Russia are re-establishing direct communication, leaving Europe in the background. Europe, once the self-proclaimed leader of the free world, has been sidelined. And Britain, under Starmer, is desperately trying to stay relevant in a world that no longer needs its input. Even NATO's role is now under question. For decades, NATO was considered the backbone of Western security, but with the US pivoting towards direct negotiations with Russia, is the alliance losing its significance? Perhaps the most unsettling realization for Starmer is that his entire foreign policy strategy now looks outdated. His approach hinged on the assumption that the UK could play a major role in the post-war security architecture. But if the US and Russia reach an agreement without NATO's involvement, Britain's influence will be reduced to mere rhetoric. The real question now is, will Europe accept its diminished role, or will it find a way to reassert itself? Can Trump truly bring an end to the war, or is this just the beginning of a new diplomatic showdown? This story is far from over.